8 weeks that changed me. Have you ever woken up in the morning and quietly asked yourself, what am I still trying for? I didn't ask that question once. I asked it again and again during the last 8 weeks of my life in the United States. Not while looking in the mirror, but while sitting alone in my car, parked in an empty lot, the air conditioner humming softly. Outside, it was a perfect American day, blue sky, calm, beautiful. Everything looked fine. But inside, it wasn't. And in that moment, I finally understood why so many Americans leave bad relationships. Not with drama. Not with shouting. They simply choose peace. If you are learning English and feel tired, or if you are staying in a relationship that drains you more than it gives, this story might be speaking for you. I didn't begin these 8 weeks thinking I would change my life. I only told myself, just try a little longer. But that small sentence carried me into a journey I never expected. During the first week, everything looked the same as before. I was still living in the US, still working, still communicating in my good enough English. I spoke when I had to. I stayed silent when it felt too hard. In my relationship, I did the same. I swallowed my feelings and told myself, it's okay. It's not that bad. But my body disagreed. The human brain can endure more than we think, but it never forgets. Psychology shows that when stress lasts too long, your nervous system switches into survival mode. You don't learn well. You don't love well. And you don't speak well, no matter what language you use. In the second week, I started observing Americans around me more closely. At coffee shops, grocery stores, parks. They spoke directly. They smiled without forcing it. What surprised me most was this: many of them were divorced, separated, or had left long relationships. Yet they didn't look defeated. They looked calm. As if they were saying, I chose myself. I began to wonder why leaving scared me so much. Was it loneliness? Or was it fear of being judged? By the third week, the weather began to change. Where I live, the evenings became colder. You know that feeling, warm sunlight during the day, then sudden cold after sunset. My emotions followed the same pattern. I was fine during the day. At night, my thoughts became heavier. I opened YouTube and listened to slow English videos. Not to memorize words, but to hear real people talk about real feelings. I noticed something interesting. When you listen to true stories in another language, your brain processes them more slowly. And because of that, it becomes less defensive. You begin to feel them more deeply. In the fourth week, I tried something small but scary. I spoke one honest sentence, imperfect English, but real emotion. I said, I feel tired, not because of work, but because I don't feel heard. That sentence didn't fix everything, but it made me lighter. Psychology calls this labeling emotions. When you name what you feel, its power decreases. It works in any language. By the fifth week, I started to understand something very American: boundaries. Americans don't leave bad relationships because they can't handle pain. They leave because they refuse to live with pain forever. The difference is small, but the result is huge. I realized I had confused patience with self-harm. I believed endurance meant love. In the 6th week, my way of learning English changed. I stopped forcing myself to study. Instead, I slowly told my own story, like speaking to a close friend. I noticed something surprising. When the story is real, words come naturally. When emotions are clear, pronunciation becomes less frightening. By the 7th week, one question became impossible to ignore. Do you choose peace? Not running away, but choosing a life where you don't have to tense your body every day. The brain loves familiarity, even when it hurts. Peace requires courage. In the 8th week, I didn't make a dramatic decision. There was no big announcement. Just a quiet shift inside me. I no longer felt trapped. I was still in America. Still learning English. Still walking through challenges in marriage. But I understood something important. Americans don't leave bad relationships because they are selfish. They leave because they refuse to trade their entire life for something that slowly empties them. And if you are listening to this story to practice English, listening, reading, speaking, remember this. You don't need perfect stories to learn a language. You need a real one. Because in the end, language doesn't save you. Peace does. Why Americans walk away. If you grow up believing that love means endurance, then watching Americans walk away from bad relationships can feel confusing, even wrong. That was exactly how I felt at the beginning of these 8 weeks. In my mind, leaving meant failure. Staying meant strength. But living in the United States slowly challenged that belief, not through lectures or advice, but through quiet observations that stayed with me longer than I expected. I noticed it first in small conversations. Someone at work casually mentioned a divorce, the same way they might talk about changing jobs. No shame. No dramatic backstory. Just facts. Another person said, it wasn't healthy anymore, so I left. That sentence stayed in my head for days. It wasn't healthy anymore. Not abusive. Not explosive. Just unhealthy. I realized something important. Americans don't wait until everything is broken beyond repair. Many of them leave when they feel their inner peace slowly disappearing. During my 2nd week, I began to connect this idea to my own life. I had stayed in difficult moments telling myself, this is normal. Relationships are hard. And yes, relationships are hard. Learning English is hard too. But there is a difference between something being challenging and something being damaging. Psychology makes this distinction clear. Short-term stress can help us grow. Long-term emotional stress, however, slowly rewires the brain. It increases anxiety, lowers motivation, and makes it harder to think clearly. When I learned this, I stopped asking, why do Americans leave so easily, and started asking, why did I stay so long? Americans are taught, from a young age, to value individual well-being. This doesn't mean they are selfish. It means they are trained to listen to warning signs early. In relationships, those signs often appear as constant tension, fear of honest conversations, or the feeling that you must shrink yourself to keep peace. I recognized all of these signs in my own experience. Yet I had ignored them, believing that sacrifice was proof of love. At the same time, I noticed how this mindset appeared in language learning. When Americans struggle to learn something, they don't usually blame themselves as stupid. They say, "This method doesn't work for me." Then they change the method. In contrast, I blamed myself. When English felt hard, I stayed silent. When my relationship felt heavy, I stayed quiet too. Silence became my coping strategy. But silence, I learned, is not peace. It is postponed pain. Around the middle of the week, I came across a simple sentence in English that felt surprisingly powerful. I deserve to feel safe. Not happy all the time. Not perfect. Just safe. That sentence is common in American therapy culture, but it felt new to me. Safety isn't only physical. Emotional safety means you can speak without fear, make mistakes without punishment, and express needs without guilt. When emotional safety disappears, Americans often see leaving as an act of responsibility, not betrayal. I started to understand that many Americans don't leave relationships because they stop loving. They leave because they start loving themselves enough to notice the damage. This realization was uncomfortable. It forced me to face a painful truth. Sometimes staying is easier than leaving, not because it is better, but because it is familiar. The brain prefers known pain over unknown peace. Neuroscience explains this clearly. Familiar patterns, even unhealthy ones, feel predictable. Predictability feels safe to the brain. Change, even positive change, feels threatening. This insight helped me see my own fear more clearly. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of uncertainty. What happens after you choose peace? What happens after you speak honestly? Americans seem more willing to accept uncertainty as part of growth. They believe that discomfort now can prevent deeper suffering later. This belief shows up not only in relationships, but also in career changes, relocations, and personal reinvention. As I reflected on this, my relationship with English changed again. I realized that Americans don't wait to feel ready before speaking. They speak, adjust, and learn along the way. Leaving a bad relationship follows the same logic. You don't wait until you feel brave. You act, and courage follows. That idea challenged everything I believed about timing and readiness. By the end of the week, I stopped judging the act of leaving. I no longer saw it as weakness. I began to see it as a boundary. A line drawn not in anger, but in clarity. Americans walk away not because they fear pain, but because they respect their limits. They understand that constant emotional exhaustion is not the price of love. It is a warning sign. And if you are listening to this story to practice English, let this idea sink in slowly. Learning a language is not about forcing yourself to endure discomfort forever. It is about choosing methods that support your peace. If a relationship or a learning habit makes you feel small, silent, and tense every day, that is not growth. That is erosion. Americans walk away because they believe peace is not something you earn after suffering long enough. It is something you are allowed to choose. And once I truly understood that, I knew this journey was no longer just about English, or marriage, or culture. It was about permission the permission to stop surviving and start living. Peace vs. staying silent. Silence can look like peace, especially when you are tired. For a long time, I believed that if I stayed quiet, everything would eventually calm down. No arguments. No tension. No emotional explosions. Just quiet. But during these 8 weeks in the United States, I began to understand a hard truth. Silence and peace are not the same thing. Silence is often what we choose when we are afraid. Peace is what we choose when we finally trust ourselves. I learned this lesson slowly, not from a single moment, but from many small ones. In my relationship, silence had become my default language. When something hurt, I didn't say it. When I felt misunderstood, I told myself it wasn't worth explaining. I convinced myself that keeping the peace meant keeping my mouth shut. In English, there is a phrase people often use, keep the peace. But no one ever explains the cost. Peace that requires you to disappear is not peace. It is emotional withdrawal. Psychology explains why silence feels safer in the short term. When we avoid conflict, our stress response temporarily decreases. The body relaxes. The heart rate slows. The brain thinks, good, danger avoided. But that relief is temporary. Over time, unspoken emotions don't disappear. They accumulate. Research shows that emotional suppression increases anxiety, reduces memory function, and weakens emotional bonds. In simple words, what you don't say doesn't go away. It stays inside, and it grows. I noticed the same pattern in my English learning. When I didn't know how to express something, I stayed quiet. I nodded. I smiled. I used safe phrases. I'm fine. No problem. It's okay. These phrases are easy, but they are also empty. They protect you from embarrassment, but they also block real connection. In relationships and in language, silence becomes a habit before you realize it has become a prison. One evening during the 3rd week, I sat in my car after a long day. The sky was dark, the street lights soft and yellow. I practiced English sentences quietly, almost whispering. Not grammar drills, real thoughts. I feel overwhelmed. I don't know how to say this. I need time. Speaking these sentences out loud felt strangely emotional. Neuroscience explains why. When you speak emotions instead of just thinking them, different parts of the brain activate. Your feelings become organized. They feel more manageable. That night, I realized something important. Staying silent had cost me more energy than speaking ever did. Silence requires constant self-control. You must monitor your words, your tone, your reactions. Peace, on the other hand, feels lighter. It allows honesty without fear. That difference became clearer as I watched how Americans communicate. Americans are often described as direct. At first, that directness felt uncomfortable to me. It seemed rude or cold. But as I paid closer attention, I noticed something else. They say what they mean early, before resentment builds. They express discomfort before it turns into anger. This is not because they enjoy conflict. It is because they understand that small, honest conversations prevent large, painful ones later. In American culture, Silence is often interpreted as distance, not respect. If you don't speak, people assume you are disengaged or unhappy. This cultural difference helped me see my own silence differently. I wasn't protecting harmony. I was slowly disconnecting from my partner, from myself, and even from the language I was trying to learn. By the 5th week, I tried another small experiment. Instead of staying silent, I spoke one honest sentence when something felt wrong. Not an accusation. Not a long explanation. Just a sentence. This doesn't feel okay for me. My voice shook. My English wasn't perfect. But something unexpected happened. The world didn't collapse. In fact, the tension I feared didn't increase. It shifted. It became visible, and because it was visible, it became manageable. Therapists often say that unspoken needs are unmet needs. Silence teaches others how to treat you. If you say nothing, people assume everything is acceptable. This idea was uncomfortable, but it was also freeing. It meant that choosing peace required participation. Peace was not something that arrived if I endured long enough. It was something I had to actively create through honesty. This insight changed how I approached English practice as well. I stopped waiting for perfect sentences. I allowed myself to speak slowly, imperfectly, emotionally. I noticed that people responded more warmly when my words were real, even if they weren't grammatically perfect. Communication is not about correctness. It is about clarity and intention. By the end of the week, I understood that silence and peace stand on opposite sides of the same fear. Silence says, I don't trust this moment. Peace says, I trust myself. One keeps you safe for a moment. The other keeps you whole in the long run. If you are listening to this story and recognizing yourself, let this land gently. You don't have to say everything at once. You don't have to be fluent. You only have to be honest. In relationships, in language learning, and in life. Peace is not found in what you avoid saying. It is found in what you finally allow yourself to express. Weather outside, storm inside. Weather has a strange way of telling the truth. During these 8 weeks in the United States, I began to notice how closely the climate around me matched what was happening inside my body. On the surface, everything looked calm. Blue skies, wide roads, clean neighborhoods. But just like the weather, emotions can change without warning. And when they do, you feel it everywhere. Where I live, the days often start warm and bright. Sunlight fills the air, and for a moment, everything feels possible. Then evening arrives. The temperature drops quickly. The wind picks up. That sudden shift reminded me of my emotional life. During the day, I functioned. I worked, spoke English, smiled when needed. At night, the storm came. Thoughts became heavier. Feelings I had ignored during the day demanded attention. This contrast taught me something important. When your environment changes faster than your emotions can adapt, stress increases. Science supports this connection. Studies show that weather patterns influence mood and energy levels. Reduced sunlight can increase fatigue and emotional sensitivity. Sudden temperature changes put extra pressure on the nervous system. When the body is already under emotional stress, like staying in an unhealthy relationship, these environmental factors make everything feel more intense. I wasn't just tired. My system was overloaded. I started to notice how Americans talk about weather. It's not just small talk. It's awareness. It's going to be cold tonight. A storm is coming. They prepare. They adjust. They don't blame themselves for the weather. That idea stayed with me. In my emotional life, I had been blaming myself for storms I didn't create. I told myself I was too sensitive, too emotional, too weak. But maybe I was just standing outside without a jacket, pretending I wasn't cold. This realization hit me one evening as I walked through a quiet neighborhood. The sky was clear, but the air was sharp. I pulled my coat tighter and thought about how often I had ignored emotional warning signs. Tight chest, shallow breathing, constant tension. These were my internal weather reports. And like real weather, they were trying to tell me something. In relationships, Americans often talk about emotional climate. If the environment feels cold, distant, or unpredictable, people don't wait forever hoping it will change. They pay attention. They ask questions. They decide whether it's safe to stay. I realized that I had been living in an emotional climate where I never knew what temperature I would face. That uncertainty kept my nervous system on edge. The same pattern appeared in my English learning. On days when I felt emotionally cold, my English felt frozen. Words disappeared. My mouth felt stiff. On days when I felt calm and supported, my speech flowed more naturally. Neuroscience explains this clearly. Language production depends on a relaxed nervous system. When you feel threatened, emotionally or socially, the brain prioritizes survival, not communication. By the middle of the week, I began to make small adjustments, just like people do with weather. I chose quieter moments to practice English. I spoke more slowly. I allowed pauses. I also allowed myself to step back emotionally when conversations felt overwhelming. This wasn't avoidance. It was regulation. Psychologists call this self-regulation, the ability to respond to stress instead of reacting automatically. I noticed how Americans normalize this behavior. If someone feels overwhelmed, they say, "I need some space." If work becomes too much, they take a break. These actions are not seen as weakness. They are seen as maintenance. Just like checking the forecast and adjusting plans, emotional awareness is part of daily life. This shift in perspective helped me stop judging myself. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" I started asking, "What am I responding to?" That single question changed everything. It moved the focus from self-blame to self-understanding. By the end of the week, I understood that storms are not signs of failure. They are signals. Weather changes whether we want it to or not. Emotional climates change too. The difference is that we can choose how long we stay exposed. Americans leave bad relationships not because they can't handle storms, but because they recognize when a storm has become the climate. If you are learning English through this story, remember this. Your struggles are not personal flaws. They are responses to your environment, emotional, social, and psychological. When you create a calmer inner climate, learning becomes easier, speaking becomes safer, and relationships become clearer. The weather outside will always change. That is life. But inside, you are allowed to build shelter. You are allowed to protect your peace. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is stop standing in the storm, pretending it isn't raining. Culture shock in love. When people talk about culture shock, they usually mean food, language, or lifestyle. Few people talk about culture shock in love. But during these 8 weeks in the United States, that was the shock that hit me the hardest. Not the accents. Not the customs. But the way Americans understand love, conflict, and emotional responsibility. It quietly challenged everything I thought was normal. In many cultures, love is closely tied to endurance. You stay. You try harder. You sacrifice. If something feels wrong, you look inward and ask what you can tolerate better. I carried that belief with me when I came to the US. I believed that good relationships require silence, patience, and emotional flexibility. But slowly, through observation, I realized that Americans often see love through a different lens. To them, love is not proven by how much pain you can survive, but by how safe you feel being yourself. This realization didn't come from one big moment. It came from everyday conversations. I listened to Americans talk about their partners using words like support, respect, and boundaries. These words appeared again and again. At first, they sounded clinical, almost cold. Where was the passion? The sacrifice? But then I noticed something important. People who used these words looked calmer, more grounded. Their relationships didn't feel dramatic. They felt sustainable. Culture shock often happens when your internal rules stop working. I had rules like, don't say too much. And don't make things harder. And love means adjusting yourself. In American culture, many people operate under different rules. They say what they feel early. They address discomfort before it turns into resentment. They believe that unresolved emotional tension is more dangerous than an honest conversation. Psychology supports this approach. Research shows that relationships with clear communication and emotional boundaries have higher long-term satisfaction. Suppressed emotions, on the other hand, predict burnout and disconnection. This helped me understand why so many Americans choose to leave relationships that feel emotionally heavy. They don't see it as giving up. They see it as preventing deeper harm. I noticed this difference clearly when observing couples in public spaces. They spoke openly, sometimes disagreeing calmly. They didn't avoid discomfort. They navigated it. In contrast, I had learned to avoid conflict at all costs. But avoidance doesn't remove conflict. It only delays it. And delayed conflict often grows stronger in the dark. This cultural difference also appeared in how Americans talk about personal growth. They believe that change is a sign of maturity, not instability. Ending a relationship can be framed as learning, not failing. This mindset felt both freeing and frightening. Freeing because it allowed movement. Frightening because it removed excuses. If growth is allowed, then staying in pain becomes a choice, not a duty. As I reflected on this, I saw how deeply culture influenced my approach to English learning as well. I waited until I felt ready to speak. I feared making mistakes. Americans, however, see mistakes as part of the process. They speak, adjust, and keep going. The same principle applies to love. You communicate, you learn, and sometimes you leave, not because you failed, but because you learned enough to choose differently. By the middle of the week, I began questioning my old definitions. What if love doesn't mean losing yourself? What if patience has a limit? What if staying silent is not kindness, but fear? These questions were uncomfortable, but necessary. Culture shock is not meant to be comfortable. It is meant to wake you up. I also noticed how Americans separate love from suffering. In many conversations, emotional pain was treated as a warning, not a badge of honor. If something hurts consistently, it matters. This doesn't mean relationships should be easy. It means they should not feel like emotional survival. This perspective helped me show more compassion toward myself. I stopped seeing my exhaustion as weakness. I started seeing it as information. My body and mind were reacting to a mismatch between my values and my reality. Culture shock, in this sense, became a mirror. By the end of the week, I realized that culture shock in love is not about choosing one culture over another. It is about choosing what allows you to live with integrity. Americans leave bad relationships not because they lack loyalty, but because their culture gives them permission to prioritize emotional health. If you are listening to this story while practicing English, take this lesson gently. Learning a language is also shaped by culture. If your learning environment feels harsh, shaming, or exhausting, you are allowed to choose a kinder approach. Growth does not require suffering. Love does not require self-erasure. Culture shock taught me that love, at its healthiest, feels like safety. And when love stops feeling safe, choosing peace is not betrayal. It is self-respect. Boundaries Americans protect. For a long time, the word boundaries made me uncomfortable. It sounded cold, distant, even selfish. During my early years, I was taught that good relationships required flexibility, adjusting yourself, bending quietly, giving more when things felt tense. Boundaries, in that worldview, felt like walls. But over the last 8 weeks in the United States, I learned that Americans don't use boundaries to push people away. They use them to protect what matters most: their mental health, their identity, and their peace. I began noticing boundaries everywhere once I knew how to look. People at work would say things like, "I can't talk about this right now," or "I need the weekend to reset." No long explanations. No apologies. Just clarity. At first, this felt shocking. Where I come from, refusing can feel rude. Setting limits can feel like rejection. But here, it was normal. Even respected. And slowly, I realized how much emotional energy boundaries actually save. In relationships, this difference felt even stronger. Americans often talk about what they are not okay with early and clearly. Not in anger, but in honesty. They don't wait until resentment builds. They don't collect silent disappointments like evidence for a future argument. This was completely different from my habit of staying quiet and hoping things would improve on their own. Psychology explains why boundaries matter so much. Healthy boundaries reduce chronic stress by giving the nervous system predictability. When you know what is acceptable and what is not, your brain can relax. When boundaries are unclear or constantly crossed, the brain stays alert, scanning for danger. That constant alertness drains energy, focus, and emotional resilience. I realized that my exhaustion wasn't just emotional, it was neurological. This insight hit me deeply when I connected it to my own relationship. I had believed that love meant availability at all times. If I needed space, I felt guilty. If something hurt me, I minimized it. I thought boundaries would damage closeness. But the opposite was true. The absence of boundaries had damaged me. The same pattern existed in my English learning. I pushed myself to speak even when I was overwhelmed. I listened to fast conversations I couldn't process. I stayed in environments that made me anxious, believing that pressure would make me stronger. But pressure without safety doesn't create growth. It creates shutdown. Neuroscience confirms this. Learning happens best when the brain feels safe, not threatened. Americans seem to understand this intuitively. They adjust their environment to support performance. If something doesn't work, they change it. They don't treat discomfort as proof of effort. They treat it as feedback. This mindset helped me reframe boundaries not as limits, but as instructions. Boundaries tell others how to interact with you. They also tell you how to take care of yourself. One moment stood out clearly. Someone I knew calmly said, "I can't continue this conversation if it becomes disrespectful." No anger. No drama. Just a clear line. I remember thinking how powerful that sounded. Not aggressive. Not weak. Just grounded. That sentence carried more self-respect than 1,000 silent sacrifices. As the week progressed, I experimented with small boundaries of my own. I chose when to speak and when to rest. I limited conversations that left me drained. I practiced English in calm, supportive spaces instead of forcing myself into stressful ones. At first, guilt appeared. That was expected. Guilt is often the emotional response to changing old patterns. But underneath the guilt, something new emerged: relief. Therapists often say that boundaries are acts of self-trust. They signal that you believe your needs matter. This idea challenged me deeply. I had spent years proving my worth through endurance. Americans, I realized, often prove self-respect through limits. Neither approach is perfect, but one leads to burnout, while the other leads to balance. In relationships, boundaries clarify responsibility. You are responsible for your actions and emotions. Others are responsible for theirs. This separation reduces emotional chaos. When boundaries are absent, people absorb each other's stress, anger, and fear. Over time, love becomes heavy. Americans leave bad relationships not because they don't care, but because they recognize when emotional weight has exceeded healthy limits. By the end of the week, boundaries no longer felt cold to me. They felt kind. Kind to the body that carries stress. Kind to the mind that needs clarity. Kind to the heart that wants connection without self-erasure. I realized that peace is not passive. It is protected. If you are learning English through this story, let this lesson apply to you too. You are allowed to learn at your pace. You are allowed to pause. You are allowed to choose environments that support your confidence. Struggle is part of growth, but suffering is optional. Americans protect boundaries because they understand something simple and powerful. Without limits, love turns into survival. With boundaries, love has space to breathe. And once I understood that, choosing peace stopped feeling like loss. It started feeling like wisdom. Learning English through real pain. I used to believe that learning English was a technical problem. Vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation. If I failed, it meant I hadn't studied hard enough. But during these 8 weeks in the United States, I discovered something uncomfortable and strangely freeing. My biggest barrier to learning English was not language at all. It was unprocessed emotion. Pain I had never given a voice to was blocking my ability to speak, both in English and in life. Pain has a way of stealing words. When you are emotionally overwhelmed, your brain prioritizes protection over expression. Neuroscience explains this clearly. Under stress, the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, becomes more active, while the prefrontal cortex, responsible for language and reasoning, becomes less accessible. In simple terms, when you feel unsafe, words disappear. This is why arguments leave people speechless, and why learners freeze even when they know the answer. I saw this pattern in myself again and again. In difficult moments, my English vanished. Not because I didn't know the words, but because I didn't feel safe enough to use them. For a long time, I blamed my ability. Then I started asking a different question. What am I feeling right now? That question changed everything. During the 7th week, I stopped using English as a performance tool. I stopped trying to sound fluent. Instead, I used English as a container for feelings I had been carrying silently. I spoke slowly. I used simple sentences. I feel confused. I feel tired. I feel afraid. These sentences were not impressive, but they were real. And reality, I learned, is far more powerful than perfection. Psychologists talk about narrative processing, the idea that humans heal by turning experiences into stories. When pain remains wordless, it stays chaotic. When you give it language, it becomes organized. That organization reduces emotional intensity and increases clarity. I wasn't just practicing English. I was reorganizing my inner world. I noticed something unexpected. When I spoke about real emotions, my English improved. Naturally. My pronunciation softened. My pauses felt intentional, not awkward. People listened more carefully. This aligns with research in language learning that shows emotional engagement improves Retention and fluency. When learning is connected to personal meaning, the brain releases dopamine, a chemical linked to motivation and memory. For the first time, English felt useful. Not for work. Not for survival. But for honesty. I realized that many Americans learn to communicate emotions early. They are encouraged to use their words. That habit creates emotional literacy, the ability to recognize, name, and express feelings. Emotional literacy, I discovered, is closely tied to language confidence. In contrast, I had learned to endure quietly. Pain was something to manage internally. Speaking about it felt like weakness. But Americans often see expression as responsibility. If something hurts, you say it. If something feels wrong, you name it. Silence is not maturity. It is avoidance. This cultural difference helped me reframe my learning process. I stopped treating English as a test and started treating it as a bridge. A bridge between what I felt and what I could share. I didn't need advanced vocabulary. I needed permission to be imperfect. One evening, I recorded myself telling my story in English. Not for anyone else. Just for me. I spoke about confusion, fear, and exhaustion. Listening back, I noticed mistakes. But I also noticed something else. My voice sounded calm. Grounded. Alive. That mattered more than accuracy. There is a concept in therapy called felt safety. Learning accelerates when the learner feels emotionally safe. This is why children learn languages faster than adults. They are not afraid of being wrong. Adults, especially those carrying emotional pain, often associate mistakes with judgment. That fear blocks learning. By allowing pain into my English practice, I removed some of that fear. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was trying to understand myself. And in doing so, I spoke more freely. This taught me an important lesson. Fluency is not confidence. Confidence is safety. Americans often leave bad relationships because those relationships make them emotionally unsafe. Constant criticism, unpredictability, or silence erode trust in oneself. When you don't trust yourself, speaking becomes risky. Learning becomes exhausting. Peace restores that trust. As the week continued, I practiced English in moments of calm. I paired learning with regulation, slow breathing, gentle pacing. Acceptance of pauses. These small adjustments changed my relationship with language. English no longer felt like an enemy demanding perfection. It felt like a companion, willing to walk with me. Through discomfort, I began to understand that pain doesn't have to disappear before you learn. You don't need to be healed to speak. You need to be honest. Honesty reduces internal conflict. Reduced conflict frees cognitive resources. That is science, not motivation. If you are listening to this story to practice English, let this be permission. You don't need dramatic stories. You don't need perfect grammar. You need truth, spoken slowly. Your real life is enough material. Learning English through real pain doesn't mean reliving trauma. It means acknowledging your experience and giving it language. When you do that, something shifts. You stop fighting yourself. And when that fight ends, learning begins. I didn't improve my English by pushing harder. I improved it by listening to my body, my emotions, my limits. Americans often choose peace because peace creates space. Space for growth. Space for language. Space for a future that doesn't require silence. And once I learned English this way, through truth, not pressure, I realized something profound. The goal was never fluency. The goal was freedom. Do you choose peace? There is a question that sounds simple, almost gentle, but once it enters your life, it refuses to leave. Do you choose peace? During these 8 weeks in the United States, that question followed me everywhere. It appeared while I was driving alone, while washing dishes, while practicing English in a quiet room. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was calm. And that calm made it harder to ignore. At first, I misunderstood the question. I thought choosing peace meant avoiding conflict, lowering expectations, staying quiet so nothing would break. That was how I had always survived. But Americans use the word peace differently. For them, peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the absence of constant inattention. And once I understood that difference, I realized why this question hurts so much. Psychologically, humans are wired to avoid uncertainty. The brain prefers what is familiar, even when it is painful. This is called the familiar pain bias. Known discomfort feels safer than unknown possibility. That is why people stay in bad relationships. That is why learners stay stuck in ineffective study habits. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because suffering has rules they already understand. I saw this clearly in myself. I knew how to be silent. I knew how to endure. I knew how to lower my needs and call it maturity. Peace, on the other hand, felt unfamiliar. Peace meant honesty, boundaries, change. And change always comes with uncertainty. During the 8th week, I noticed how Americans talk about peace in everyday language. They say things like, "This doesn't feel right anymore," or "I need something healthier." These sentences are not attacks. They are assessments. Americans often treat emotional well-being the way they treat physical health. If something consistently hurts, you don't ignore it. You investigate. And if it continues, you change course. This mindset forced me to look at my own life without excuses. I asked myself questions I had avoided for years. Do I feel safe expressing myself? Do I feel lighter or heavier after conversations? Does my body relax or tense in this relationship? Neuroscience tells us that the body often knows the answer before the mind does. Chronic tension, shallow breathing, and fatigue are signals, not weaknesses. The same question applied to my English learning. Did my study methods create peace or pressure? Did I feel curious or ashamed? When learning felt like punishment, my progress slowed. When it felt supportive, my confidence grew. This is not coincidence. Learning research shows that positive emotional states enhance cognitive flexibility and memory. Peace makes learning possible. One evening, I sat quietly and practiced one sentence in English. I want a peaceful life. The sentence felt heavier than it should have. Not because of the words, but because of what they demanded. Wanting peace means being willing to disappoint others. It means accepting that not everyone will understand your choices. It means letting go of roles that once defined you. Americans often choose peace by choosing themselves. This idea is frequently misunderstood as selfishness. But self-centeredness and self-respect are not the same. Self-respect involves understanding your limits and honoring them. It reduces resentment. It prevents emotional burnout. Many Americans leave bad relationships not because they stop caring, but because they start caring about their long-term well-being. Therapists often say that peace is a practice, not a destination. You don't arrive there once and stay forever. You choose it again and again through small decisions. Speaking honestly instead of staying silent. Resting instead of pushing. Leaving situations that consistently drain you. These choices feel uncomfortable at first because they disrupt old patterns. I noticed that every time I chose peace in a small way, my body responded immediately. My shoulders dropped. My breathing slowed. My thoughts became clearer. This physiological response is well documented. When stress decreases, the parasympathetic nervous system activates, promoting calm, focus, and emotional regulation. Peace is not just an idea. It is a physical state. This realization changed how I viewed courage. Courage was no longer dramatic action. It was quiet alignment. Choosing what supports your nervous system instead of what satisfies expectations. Americans seem to value this alignment deeply. They see emotional exhaustion as a reason to reassess, not as proof of commitment. I began to understand that staying is not always brave. Sometimes staying is simply familiar. Leaving, or changing, requires imagination, the ability to picture a different life. Peace requires imagination, because it asks you to believe that life can feel lighter than it does now. As this question settled into me, I stopped demanding immediate answers. Choosing peace doesn't always mean leaving right away. Sometimes it means changing how you show up. Sometimes it means seeking support. Sometimes it means saying no. The form varies, but the direction is the same, toward safety, clarity, and self-trust. If you are listening to this story to practice English, let this question stay with you gently. You don't have to answer it today. Just notice how your body reacts to it. Language learning, like relationships, improves when pressure decreases. Peace creates space. Space allows growth. Americans don't leave bad relationships because they chase happiness. They leave because they refuse to live in constant emotional tension. They understand that peace is not a luxury. It is a foundation. When I finally allowed myself to consider peace as a valid choice, something shifted. I didn't suddenly know what to do. But I stopped feeling trapped. And that feeling, freedom from constant inner conflict, was the clearest sign that I was finally asking the right question. Do you choose peace? Leaving is not failure. For a long time, I believed that leaving meant losing. Leaving a relationship. Leaving a plan. Leaving a version of myself I had worked hard to maintain. In my mind, leaving was proof that I wasn't strong enough to endure. But during these 8 weeks in the United States, that belief began to collapse, slowly, quietly, and without drama. Americans have a different relationship with the idea of leaving. They don't always frame it as quitting. They often see it as correcting direction. This perspective challenged me deeply because I had been taught that endurance equals virtue. Stay longer. Try harder. Sacrifice more. If something hurts, it means you're doing it right. But pain, I learned, is not evidence of commitment. Sometimes it is evidence of misalignment. Psychologically, humans struggle with loss more than with suffering. This is known as loss aversion. The brain perceives loss as more painful than an equivalent gain feels pleasurable. So we stay, even when staying costs us our peace, our health, our voice. We convince ourselves that leaving would be worse than enduring. In reality, we are often protecting familiarity, not happiness. I saw this clearly in American conversations about relationships. When people talked about leaving, they rarely spoke with anger. They spoke with clarity. They said things like, "I changed," or "This no longer supports who I am." These statements were not accusations. They were acknowledgments. Americans seem more willing to accept that people grow in different directions, and that forcing alignment can cause more damage than separation. This idea softened something inside me. It allowed me to question my own narrative of failure. What if leaving is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of self-awareness? What if staying in constant pain is not loyalty, but fear? During the 9th week of reflection, I looked at the emotional cost of staying in situations that drained me. I noticed how much energy it took to explain myself, to minimize my needs, to tolerate silence. That energy came from somewhere. It came from my capacity to learn, to connect, to rest. Every ounce spent on survival was an ounce taken from growth. This realization applied directly to my English learning journey. 4 years. I forced myself to study in ways that made me anxious. I stayed with methods that made me feel stupid, because I believed leaving them meant giving up. But when I changed my approach, slower pace, simpler materials, emotional relevance, I didn't lose progress. I gained momentum. Learning science supports this. Cognitive load theory explains that the brain has limited processing capacity. When emotional stress consumes that capacity, learning suffers. Leaving high-stress environments, whether emotional or educational, is not avoidance. It is optimization. Americans often normalize changing paths. They change majors. They change careers. They change relationships. This flexibility is sometimes criticized as instability. But there is another interpretation, adaptability. Adaptability requires self-trust, the belief that you can survive change and rebuild meaning. I began to understand that leaving becomes traumatic only when it is framed as failure. When leaving is framed as choice, it becomes empowering. Choice restores agency. Agency restores dignity. And dignity is essential for healing. One night, I practiced saying one sentence in English. I left because I needed peace. The sentence felt firm, not defensive. That surprised me. I realized that language carries emotional weight. When your reasons are clear, your words don't shake. Americans often leave bad relationships, after they have reached this clarity. Not in anger. Not in chaos. But in quiet certainty. This doesn't mean leaving is easy. Grief often follows. Even when the decision is right. The brain mourns what could have been, not just what was. But grief is not evidence of regret. It is evidence of attachment. You can honor attachment without sacrificing your future. Therapists often say that boundaries are not walls, they are doors. They define where you end and another person begins. Leaving is sometimes the final boundary, a necessary one when all others have been ignored or violated. Americans tend to respect this boundary more openly, seeing it as self-protection rather than punishment. As I absorbed this mindset, I felt a subtle shift. I stopped judging my past endurance. I stopped labeling my survival as strength. Strength, I realized, is not how much pain you can tolerate. It is how quickly you recognize what is harming you. This reframing brought relief. It also brought responsibility. If leaving is not failure, then staying without reflection is not virtue. Every choice carries weight. Peace is not passive. It requires discernment. If you are listening to this story while practicing English, notice how language changes when shame is removed. You don't need complicated explanations. You need honest ones. Simple sentences carry power when they are rooted in truth. Americans leave bad relationships because they value sustainability. A life built on constant emotional strain is not sustainable. Leaving is sometimes the only way to preserve your ability to love, learn, and live fully. By the end of this reflection, I understood something essential. Leaving didn't mean I failed. It meant I listened to my body, my emotions, my limits. And listening is not weakness. It is wisdom. Leaving is not failure. It is often the first step toward peace. Choosing peace is courage. Peace is often misunderstood. Many people imagine peace as something soft, passive, or even weak. As if choosing peace means avoiding conflict, lowering standards, or giving up on love. But during my 8-week journey in the United States, I learned something very different. Choosing peace is not retreat. Choosing peace is one of the most courageous decisions a person can make. For a long time, I confused peace with boredom. If a relationship was calm, I wondered whether it was real. If life felt quiet, I worried something was missing. My nervous system had been trained to associate intensity with meaning. Drama felt like proof of passion. Stress felt like proof of commitment. Without realizing it, I was addicted to emotional noise. Psychology explains this pattern clearly. When someone grows up or spends years in unstable emotional environments, their brain adapts. The stress response becomes familiar. Cortisol and adrenaline feel normal. When calm finally appears, the brain interprets it as danger. Peace feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar feels unsafe. So we sabotage it. We pick fights. We overthink. We stay in bad relationships because chaos feels like home. In American culture, there is a growing conversation about nervous system regulation. People talk openly about therapy, boundaries, and emotional safety. I heard phrases like, "I choose peace," said without apology. Not as a slogan, but as a principle. Peace was treated as a requirement, not a reward. This shifted my thinking deeply. I began to see that choosing peace often means disappointing people. It means saying no without a long explanation. It means walking away from situations where you are constantly misunderstood. And that takes courage, because humans are wired to seek belonging, even at great personal cost. In relationships, especially romantic ones, choosing peace can feel terrifying. You fear loneliness. You fear regret. You fear judgment. But Americans often frame this choice differently. They ask, "Can I be myself here?" If the answer is consistently no, peace becomes non-negotiable. There is strong scientific support for this mindset. Chronic relational stress is linked to anxiety, depression, weakened immune function, and cognitive decline. Peace is not just emotional comfort. It is biological protection. When you choose peace, your body heals. Your mind clears. Your learning capacity improves. This was especially clear in my English practice. When I stopped forcing myself to speak perfectly and focused instead on calm, meaningful expression, my fluency improved. My pronunciation softened. My confidence grew. Peace created space for progress. I practiced simple English sentences that reflected this value. I want a peaceful life. Peace is important to me. I don't argue anymore. These sentences were not dramatic, but they felt solid. They aligned with my inner state. Language learning became less about performance and more about self-expression. Choosing peace does not mean avoiding difficult conversations. It means refusing unnecessary ones. It means knowing the difference between growth discomfort and destructive stress. Americans often emphasize this distinction. Growth may feel uncomfortable, but it does not feel unsafe. Destructive stress erodes your sense of self. One afternoon, I noticed how Americans handle disagreements. Many walk away early. They don't wait until resentment explodes. They don't collect evidence to justify leaving. They trust their internal signals. If something feels consistently wrong, they listen. This trust is a form of courage. Courage is often portrayed as endurance. But endurance without awareness is not bravery. It is self-abandonment. Choosing peace requires awareness. Awareness leads to responsibility. Responsibility leads to change. There is also a cultural permission in the US to redesign life. People talk about starting over without shame. This normalizes the idea that peace is worth rebuilding for. You don't need to suffer forever just because you invested time before. Time invested does not obligate future pain. This idea helped me release guilt. I stopped asking whether I had tried hard enough. Instead, I asked whether I felt safe enough. That question changed everything. Safety became my metric. Peace became my compass. For viewers learning English through this story, notice how often peace-related words are simple, calm, quiet, safe, enough. You don't need advanced vocabulary to describe a healthy life. You need clarity. Peace simplifies language because it simplifies thought. Choosing peace is not dramatic. It rarely comes with applause. Sometimes it comes with silence. Sometimes with misunderstanding. But over time, it brings alignment. And alignment brings energy. By the end of this phase of my journey, I understood that peace is not what you choose after everything works out. Peace is what you choose to make things work out. It is proactive. It is protective. It is brave. Americans leave bad relationships not because they don't value love, but because they value peace enough to protect it. And peace, once chosen, teaches you how to live. Again, slowly, clearly, and honestly. Choosing peace is courage in its quietest form. What peace builds after leaving? After you leave a bad relationship, something strange happens. The noise stops, but so does the structure you were used to. No more arguments to analyze. No more emotional emergencies to solve. No more constant tension to react to. At first, this silence can feel empty, even scary. During my 8 weeks in the United States, I learned that peace does not immediately feel like happiness. Peace feels like space. And space forces you to face yourself. In the beginning, I didn't know what to do with that space. My mind kept searching for problems, as if calm were temporary and danger was about to return. This is normal. Neuroscience shows that the brain is predictive. It looks for familiar patterns to feel safe. If chaos was familiar, peace feels suspicious. Your brain keeps asking, what am I missing? Americans talk openly about this phase. They call it decompression. After leaving a bad relationship, people often feel tired, foggy, or emotionally flat. This is not weakness. It is recovery. When stress hormones drop after a long period of activation, the nervous system needs time to recalibrate. Peace is not the finish line. It is the rebuilding zone. What peace builds first is clarity. Without constant emotional interference, your thoughts become quieter. You start noticing small preferences again. What music you like. How you like your coffee. When you feel most focused. These details sound trivial, but they are signs of identity returning. In unhealthy relationships, identity slowly erodes. Peace restores it piece by piece. I noticed this restoration while practicing English. Before, my learning was driven by fear. Fear of falling behind, fear of sounding stupid, fear of wasting time. After leaving emotional stress behind, my learning became curious. I chose stories instead of drills, meaning instead of speed. My brain responded positively. Research confirms this. Intrinsic motivation improves retention and fluency. Peace makes learning stick. Another thing peace builds is honesty. When you are no longer managing someone else's emotions, you stop editing yourself so much. Your words become simpler. In English, I found myself using short, honest sentences. I feel calm now. I don't rush anymore. I like my life. These sentences may sound basic, but they reflect a stable inner state. Simplicity is a sign of alignment. In American culture, there is an emphasis on doing the work after leaving. Therapy, journaling, long walks, routines. These are not about fixing yourself. They are about understanding yourself. Peace gives you access to self-reflection without self-attack. You can ask hard questions without collapsing under them. One important realization came during this phase: peace exposes patterns. When life is calm, you start seeing which behaviors were reactions, not choices. You see how often you over-explained, how often you apologized unnecessarily, how often you abandoned your needs to keep harmony. Peace makes these patterns visible, not to shame you, but to free you. From a psychological perspective, this is integration. The brain processes past experiences and updates its internal models. This is when learning truly happens. Not during the crisis, but after it. Peace allows the brain to reorganize memory and meaning. This is why people often grow the most after leaving, not during staying. I also noticed how Americans use peace as a foundation for future relationships. They don't rush to replace what they lost. They protect their calm fiercely. They ask new questions. Does this feel easy? Can I relax around this person? These questions prioritize nervous system compatibility, not just emotional attraction. This mindset influenced how I thought about love. Love without peace is not intimacy. It is endurance. Peace doesn't make love boring. It makes love sustainable. It creates room for humor, patience, and growth. Americans who leave bad relationships often say they didn't leave to be alone, they left to be available for something healthier. For English learners watching this story, notice how the language of rebuilding is gentle. Words like rebuild, restore, relearn. You are not starting from zero. You are starting from experience. Peace allows you to reuse what you learned without repeating what hurt you. Over time, peace builds confidence, not loud confidence, but quiet trust. You trust your timing. You trust your decisions. You trust your ability to walk away again if needed. This trust reduces fear. Fear reduction improves cognitive performance. Again, science agrees, when the brain feels safe, executive function improves. By the end of this stage, I realized something important. Peace is not empty. It is fertile. It grows clarity, honesty, self-respect, and learning capacity. But only if you stay long enough to let it work. Many people leave bad relationships, but rush back into noise, because they misunderstand peace as loneliness. In reality, peace is preparation. It is building the version of you that no longer needs chaos to feel alive. What peace builds after leaving is not a new relationship first. It builds a new relationship with yourself. And that relationship becomes the standard for everything that comes next. Peace was the choice all along. At the end of these 8 weeks in the United States, I finally understood something that had been quietly waiting for me from the beginning. The story was never only about leaving a bad relationship. It was never only about learning English, or adapting to a new culture, or surviving emotional distance. The story was about choice. And the choice, every single time, was peace. When people ask why Americans leave bad relationships, they often expect dramatic answers. Betrayal. Big arguments. Sudden endings. But most of the Stories I heard were simple. People left because they were tired. Tired of explaining. Tired of shrinking. Tired of feeling unsafe in places that were supposed to feel like home. Peace did not arrive as a reward. Peace arrived as a decision. Looking back, I realized that peace had been available to me much earlier. I just didn't recognize it, because it didn't look like what I had been taught to value. I had learned to admire sacrifice, endurance, and emotional intensity. Peace felt too quiet to be important. But quiet, I learned, is where truth speaks. Neuroscience supports this insight. When the brain is constantly stimulated by conflict, it loses sensitivity to calm signals. Peace feels dull, even empty. Only after prolonged exposure to safety does the nervous system relearn how to rest. This is why peace often feels uncomfortable at first. It asks you to stop running. In the US, I noticed how people protect their peace intentionally. They choose neighborhoods, routines, and relationships that reduce friction. This is not selfishness. It is sustainability. A peaceful life gives you energy to contribute, to love, to create. Americans often say, "I don't have the capacity for that anymore." That sentence is not an excuse. It is self-knowledge. This idea changed how I spoke, to others and to myself. In English, I practiced sentences that reflected choice. I choose peace. I don't argue like before. I want a simple life. These sentences were easy to pronounce, but powerful to feel. Language became a mirror of intention. Throughout this journey, English was never the main obstacle. Fear was. Fear of being wrong. Fear of being judged. Fear of being alone. Peace dissolved that fear slowly. When fear decreased, learning accelerated. Studies show that emotional safety enhances neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to learn and adapt. Peace literally makes you smarter. This is why learning English through story works. When language is tied to emotion and meaning, the brain remembers it. And when the story is honest, the learner feels seen. You are not just practicing words. You are practicing identity. As this story closes, I want to be clear. Choosing peace does not mean life becomes perfect. Challenges still exist. Misunderstandings still happen. But peace changes how you meet them. You no longer fight every battle. You no longer prove your worth through suffering. You respond instead of react. Americans who leave bad relationships often say they feel lighter, not happier at first. Lightness comes before joy. Lightness means you are no longer carrying what was never yours to hold. From that lightness, joy can grow naturally. If you are watching this video while feeling stuck in a relationship, in your English learning, or in your life, remember this: peace is not something you wait for. It is something you choose. You choose it when you slow down. When you listen to your body. When you stop explaining yourself to people who don't want to understand. Peace was the choice all along. It was never dramatic. It was never loud. It was simply honest. And maybe that is why so many Americans leave bad relationships, not because they give up easily, but because they finally tell the truth to themselves. If this story helped you practice English, but also helped you breathe a little easier, then it has done its job. Learning is not just about words. It is about the life those words help you build. If you've made it this far, then this story wasn't just something you listened to. It was something you felt. Maybe you recognized yourself in the silence after arguments. Maybe in the exhaustion of trying to make it work. Maybe in the quiet question you've been afraid to ask. Do I choose peace, or do I stay? This story is not here to tell you what decision to make. It's here to remind you that you are allowed to choose peace. In love. In marriage. In learning English. In life. Americans leave bad relationships not because they are weak, but because they finally listen to themselves. And when you listen, everything changes. If you're learning English right now, remember this. You don't need perfect grammar to express truth. You don't need fast speech to be understood. And you don't need pain to prove commitment to anyone or to anything. This channel exists for one reason: to help you learn real English through real-life stories. Slowly, clearly, and honestly. Stories about love, culture, mistakes, growth, and choosing peace. If this video helped you practice listening, reading, or speaking English, or if it simply helped you feel less alone, then stay with this channel. Subscribe for more real English stories like this. Like the video so YouTube knows this story matters. Comment one simple sentence in English below. I choose peace. Your English will improve. Your confidence will grow. And maybe, just maybe, your life will feel lighter too. This is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a calmer one. See you in the next video.